So we're inside the Uintah Guard Station. It was constructed in 1928 by a tie cutter, probably based in the Steel Creek Commissary, which is about 300 yards west of us here. And sometime in the early 1930s, the Forest Service purchased the Uintah Guard Station from the tie cutters, and then in the mid-30s, rangers from the Wasatch National Forest oversaw tie cutting operations in the Steel Creek, Smiths Fork, and Archie Creek drainages. And so one of the coolest facets of the Uintah Guard Station is this is the place that Archie Murchie, who was a ranger for the Forest Service, lived in 1934, 1935. And he's the only person that we have an actual oral history of tie cutting on the North Slope of his entire run from the 1860s to the 1930s. He's the only oral history we've been able to find. And so in the winter of 1934, 1935, Archie Murchie lived in this cabin with his wife and infant son while he oversaw the tie cutting in the immediate area. And so all of his timber sailing he would do on snowshoe or cross-country ski. And so he'd go several miles to the north, to the south, to the east, and to the west, overseeing the tie cutters. Now what that meant was that he would oversee making sure they're cutting where they're supposed to be cutting, making sure they're taking trees of the appropriate size, and also making sure that the Forest Service was getting its royalties for what trees were being cut and turned into cordwood or railroad ties. And so he would have a U.S. stamp that he would drive into the end of logs or ties, and then that would be matched by a Standard Timber Company stamp that would go in the end of the ties. And at the end of the season, the Forest Service would tally up how many they counted, Standard Timber Company would tally up how many they counted, and then the Forest Service would get their royalties and the workers would get their pay based on those numbers. So this cabin is larger than what you would typically see a tie cutter in this period. It's a little bit over 20 feet by about 12 feet wide. It's a little bit more spacious, probably because it was originally constructed to be a multi-person dwelling, probably 6 to 8 tie cutters would have lived in here with a camp stove. Now, by the time it switched to the Forest Service, it made it ideal for life of an isolated ranger. So Archie Murchie gives us some indication of what life was like here. His wife would cook meals at night. He would usually get his breakfast over at Steel Creek Commissary with the rest of the tie cutters. And then from there, just go around to different tie camps for the rest of the day. So this cabin is currently being administered by the United States Forest Service, who still owns it. It's still being used by them for seasonal Forest Service operations. And so for staff coming up here to do hydrology, wildlife, inventories, or forestry, they can use this cabin in the same way that Archie Murchie used it in the 1930s to oversee the tie cutting back in those days, or modern lumber industry as we see it today, which now the forest is much more multiple use than back in the 1930s.